What you are about to hear was never supposed to be said out loud, and once you know it, you'll understand why the room went silent when Tom Homan stepped up to the podium that night. The cameras were already rolling, the lights burning hot against the walls, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, expecting the usual talking points, the usual political language, the usual careful answers. But something was different. You could feel it before he even spoke. Tom Homan stood there, jaw tight, eyes locked forward, holding a thin folder in his hand like it weighed more than it should have. When he finally leaned into the microphone, the sound of his first breath echoed through the room. "Let me be clear," he said. "What I'm about to explain isn't theory. It's happening right now." That single sentence changed everything. This wasn't just another press briefing. It was a warning. Homan didn't smile. He didn't soften his tone. He spoke like a man who had spent decades watching the same mistakes repeat themselves and had finally run out of patience. He explained that the United States was facing a situation most Americans didn't fully understand yet, not because the information wasn't available, but because no one wanted to connect the dots. He talked about borders, yes, but not the way politicians usually do. This wasn't about slogans or soundbites. This was about systems quietly breaking down, about enforcement gaps widening year after year, about policies written in offices far from the consequences they created. And as he spoke, you could see reporters stop typing, some lowering their phones, realizing this wasn't going to be a normal clip for social media. Homan revealed that internal reports had been circulating for months, showing numbers that didn't match public statements. Crossings that weren't counted, releases that weren't tracked, individuals who vanished into the interior without follow-up. He said the problem wasn't just scale, it was accountability, and once accountability disappears, control goes with it. Then he said something that made the room shift. "This is no longer about politics," he said. "This is about national safety, community safety, and whether we're willing to admit when a policy has failed." Some reporters exchanged looks. Others started recording again, realizing they were hearing something raw, something unscripted. Homan explained that agents on the ground were exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly ignored. They were told to process, release, and move on, even when they knew the system couldn't handle the volume. He described towns overwhelmed almost overnight, shelters stretched past capacity, local resources drained with no federal backup in sight. But more than that, he described the human cost on both sides of the border, migrants misled by false promises, smugglers growing richer, and communities left unprepared for the impact. As he spoke, one question hung in the air: why now? Homan answered it without being asked. He said there comes a moment when silence becomes complicity. When watching the numbers rise and pretending everything is under control becomes a lie too big to carry. He said he didn't expect everyone to agree with him, but he refused to keep pretending that the system wasn't breaking. Then came the line that would be replayed, debated, and criticized within hours. "If we don't change course," Homan said, "we're not just losing control of the border. We're losing control of the truth." That's when the room truly froze. Because this wasn't just a policy argument anymore. It was an accusation, not at one party or one administration, but at an entire culture of avoidance. Homan said the American people deserved honesty, not filtered narratives designed to survive a news cycle. Questions finally erupted. Reporters asked about solutions, timelines, responsibility. Homan didn't dodge them. He said enforcement without support doesn't work, compassion without structure collapses, and ignoring consequences guarantees failure. He warned that pretending the problem would solve itself was the most dangerous option of all. As the briefing ended, Homan closed the folder, stepped back from the podium, and left without another word. No handshake. No final remark. Just silence. Outside the room, clips were already spreading online. Headlines were being drafted. Supporters praised his bluntness. Critics accused him of fearmongering. But behind the noise, one thing was undeniable. Something had shifted. Because once someone says out loud what everyone else is avoiding, you can't unhear it. And as the video continued to circulate, more details began to emerge. Documents leaked. Internal emails surfaced. Numbers were compared. And slowly, painfully, a clearer picture started forming. This wasn't just about a briefing. It was about what happens when warnings are ignored for too long. And that was only the beginning. The morning after the briefing, Washington woke up pretending nothing had changed, but behind closed doors, phones were ringing nonstop. By sunrise, senior officials across multiple agencies had already watched the clip. Some watched it twice. Others forwarded it without comment, letting the words speak for themselves. Tom Homan hadn't just gone off script, he had shattered it. And now the question wasn't whether what he said was true, but how long it could be contained. Within hours, anonymous sources started whispering to journalists. Not on record, not yet, but enough to confirm something important. The documents Homan mentioned were real. Internal tracking reports showed a growing gap between what was publicly stated and what was actually happening on the ground. Numbers categorized as pending quietly rolled over month after month. Follow-ups marked deferred were never reopened. People released with notices to appear were never located again. One analyst described it bluntly. We stopped counting what we couldn't manage. That single sentence explained more than 100 press conferences ever had. Inside enforcement offices near the border, agents watched the briefing with a mix of relief and fear. Relief, because someone had finally said what they'd been living every day. Fear, because they knew what usually happened to people who said it too loudly. Homan's words echoed their reality. Overcrowded facilities. Paperwork replacing patrols. Instructions that emphasized speed over scrutiny. An agent from Texas, speaking anonymously, said the pressure wasn't subtle. Move them through. Get the numbers processed. Don't ask questions you don't have time to answer. But the questions didn't disappear. They stacked up. As the media cycle accelerated, officials scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Statements were released emphasizing compassion, humanitarian responsibility, and ongoing reviews. Carefully chosen phrases designed to calm without clarifying. But something wasn't working this time. The public response wasn't dividing cleanly along party lines. It was fracturing along trust. People weren't asking who to blame yet. They were asking what else they hadn't been told. Then the first leak hit. A scanned spreadsheet circulated among reporters, time-stamped months before the briefing. It showed intake figures, release categories, and a column labeled, location confirmed. That column was mostly blank. Not redacted. Blank. The implication was impossible to ignore. More leaks followed. Internal emails debating wording instead of outcomes. Messages warning that publishing certain figures would cause unnecessary concern. Memos recommending delays until conditions stabilize, even as conditions worsened. Homan hadn't revealed classified secrets. He'd revealed silence. Meanwhile, critics moved fast. Commentators accused him of exaggeration, of using fear to justify enforcement. But even they struggled to explain the documents. The usual arguments didn't land as cleanly when spreadsheets replaced speculation. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on Homan himself. Former colleagues urged him to clarify, soften, walk it back. He refused. According to one source, his response was simple. The truth doesn't need editing. That refusal became its own story. As days passed, communities began speaking up. Mayors described budgets stretched thin. Hospitals reported capacity strain. Schools quietly adjusted enrollment numbers without explanation. None of it felt dramatic on its own. Together, it formed a pattern. The border, it turned out, wasn't a line anymore. It was a ripple. And ripples travel. A Senate staffer leaked another detail that shifted the conversation again. There had been proposals. Structured enforcement plans paired with humanitarian funding. Tracking systems designed to close the gaps. Those proposals stalled, not because they failed, but because they required admitting the problem was bigger than anyone wanted to say. Admitting scale meant admitting responsibility. As public pressure grew, a closed-door meeting was scheduled. No cameras, no press, just senior officials, agency heads, and advisors. Homan wasn't invited. That omission didn't go unnoticed. Because by then, something else was happening. Agents were talking. Analysts were talking. Even mid-level administrators were quietly confirming what had once been denied. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was overloaded by design and sustained by denial. The narrative was slipping. And when narratives slip, control follows. By the end of the week, one question dominated every internal discussion. Not whether Homan was right, but whether the truth could still be contained. Because once people start connecting dots, statements stop working. Promises sound hollow. And explanations begin to unravel. Tom Homan hadn't started a political firestorm. He had exposed a structural one. And the next phase was coming fast. By the time the closed-door meeting finally ended, everyone inside the room understood the same uncomfortable truth, even if no one said it out loud. They had lost control of the timeline. What was once a slow-burning issue managed through careful language had accelerated into something far more dangerous. Information was moving faster than coordination. Leaks were appearing before responses could be drafted. And every attempt to minimize the story only seemed to confirm the worst assumptions. Inside the meeting, voices had risen. Not in outrage, but in calculation. Who signed off on what? When warnings were first issued? How certain data sets were classified? Each question peeled back another layer of avoidance. And with every layer removed, the reality became harder to deny. Someone finally said what everyone else had been thinking. We can't keep pretending this is temporary. That statement marked the shift from damage control to survival. The discussion turned quickly toward responsibility. Not accountability, but optics. Who could speak? Who shouldn't? Which offices could absorb criticism without collapsing? It wasn't about fixing the system yet. It was about controlling the fallout. One official suggested a limited admission. Acknowledge strain. Promise review. Avoid numbers. Another argued for silence, betting that public attention would move on. That suggestion didn't land the way it used to, because attention wasn't drifting this time. It was sharpening. Outside government buildings, the story had taken on a life of its own. Independent analysts were comparing migration data with housing reports. Journalists were mapping release locations against crime statistics, hospital intakes, and school enrollment spikes. Nothing conclusive on its own. But together, they painted a picture that felt uncomfortably real. And then the agents started breaking ranks. A Border Patrol supervisor spoke anonymously to a national outlet. He didn't criticize policy directly. He described workload. He described fatigue. He described a system asking people to move faster than accuracy allowed. The interview ended with a line that resonated across social media. We're not enforcing the border. We're managing a backlog. That line stuck. It reframed everything. The story was no longer about immigration alone. It was about institutional honesty. About what happens when numbers become liabilities instead of tools. About how systems fail quietly long before they collapse loudly. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on Tom Homan. Invitations poured in. Interviews. Panels. Private conversations. Some wanted him to expand. Others wanted him to retract. He did neither. He repeated the same message, calmly, consistently, without embellishment. The data exists, he said. You can look at it or you can ignore it. Either way, it doesn't change. That refusal to escalate frustrated both sides. Supporters wanted stronger language. Critics wanted an apology. He gave them neither. Behind the scenes, a decision was being weighed. An internal report, far more detailed than anything leaked so far, had been sitting in review for months. It outlined not just numbers, but outcomes. Missed hearings, lost contacts, secondary strain on local services. It was never meant for public release. It was meant to guide internal reform quietly. Now it represented a choice. Release it and confirm everything Homan had implied, or bury it and risk exposure later under worse conditions. The debate was fierce. Some argued transparency would restore trust. Others warned it would trigger backlash, lawsuits, political chaos. The word, panic, was used more than once. But panic, it turned out, had already arrived. Because as discussions stalled, another leak surfaced. This one wasn't data. It was audio. A recorded internal call, months old, discussing how to reframe metrics to avoid alarming headlines. No names were mentioned, but voices were recognizable. The tone wasn't malicious. It was managerial, calm, practical. That made it worse. Public reaction shifted almost instantly. The question was no longer whether the system was overwhelmed. It was whether the public had been deliberately shielded from that reality. Trust cracked. And once trust cracks, even accurate statements start sounding like lies. As protests and counter-protests erupted online, the administration faced a narrowing set of options. Silence was no longer neutral. Statements without substance fueled suspicion. Every move carried consequence. Late that night, an emergency briefing was scheduled for the following morning. This time, cameras would be allowed. Numbers would be addressed. At least some of them. Tom Homan received the invitation this time. He didn't respond immediately. Because the next move wouldn't just define the narrative. It would define the outcome. The emergency briefing was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 7 a.m., the room was already filling. Camera crews adjusted lighting. Reporters compared notes. Phones buzzed with last-minute tips. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be routine. When officials try to regain control after losing it, the moment always carries a certain electricity, and that morning, it was impossible to ignore. Tom Homan arrived quietly. No entourage. No statement. Just a nod to the security detail and a slow walk toward the back of the room. Some reporters noticed him immediately. Others only realized he was there when whispers started rippling through the crowd. His presence changed the temperature. Whatever was about to be said would be measured against what he had already put into the public record. When the briefing began, the spokesperson opened with familiar language. Commitment, compassion, review, cooperation. The words flowed smoothly, practiced, reassuring. But the room stayed tense. Everyone was waiting for the numbers. They didn't have to wait long. For transparency, the spokesperson said, "We are releasing updated internal figures." Screens lit up behind the podium. The first slide showed totals far higher than previously acknowledged. Intake numbers adjusted upward. Processing times extended. Release figures revised. Audible reactions rippled through the room. Not shouting. Not outrage. Just the sound people make when something confirms a fear they didn't want validated. Then came the second slide. The follow-up rate. The percentage of individuals whose location could be confirmed after release was significantly lower than public estimates had suggested. Not a rounding error. A structural gap. The spokesperson emphasized improvements, pilot programs, future safeguards. But the slide remained on screen long enough for cameras to lock onto it. That image would live forever. Questions exploded instantly. How long have you known? Why weren't these numbers released sooner? Were previous statements inaccurate? The spokesperson answered carefully. Language tightened. Answers lengthened without clarifying. Responsibility diffused across timelines and administrations. The strategy was clear: acknowledge strain without admitting failure. Then a reporter asked the question no one wanted to answer. Was Tom Homan right? The room went silent. The spokesperson hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. Then came the response. This situation is complex. That was it. Complex. The word landed like a dodge. At that moment, Tom Homan stood up. No microphone. No introduction. Just his voice, steady and unraised. This isn't complex, he said. It's measurable. Gasps echoed. Cameras swung toward him. Security shifted but didn't intervene. The spokesperson froze, unsure whether to interrupt or yield. Homan continued. When you stop tracking outcomes, you stop managing reality. When reality stops being managed, it doesn't disappear. It shows up in communities, budgets, and safety. The spokesperson attempted to regain control, thanking him and suggesting further discussion offline. Homan nodded, but before sitting down, he added one final line. These numbers didn't change overnight. They grew while we looked away. That was the moment the briefing lost control completely. Clips spread within minutes. Social media fractured into camps. Supporters praised the candor. Critics accused Homan of undermining authority. But even critics replayed the slides. Because numbers don't argue back. Within hours, state leaders demanded clarification. Some requested emergency funding. Others questioned federal coordination. Lawsuits were quietly discussed. Oversight hearings scheduled. The ripple became a wave. Inside agencies, morale splintered. Some employees felt exposed. Others felt vindicated. Whistleblower protections were suddenly mentioned in meetings where they'd never come up before. And then something unexpected happened. A senior official resigned. No explanation beyond a generic statement about timing and transition. But insiders knew. The resignation wasn't about policy. It was about proximity. Being close to decisions that were now impossible to defend. That resignation changed the calculus. Because it signaled consequence. By nightfall, the administration announced a full review and temporary restructuring of enforcement coordination. It sounded decisive. It wasn't. It was containment. Tom Homan declined interviews that evening. He released a short statement instead. This was never about winning an argument. It was about stopping denial. The country didn't sleep much that night. Because for the first time in a long time, the debate wasn't theoretical. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't framed as left versus right. It was about whether institutions would adapt, or fracture under the weight of their own silence. And the answer wasn't clear yet. By the next morning, the word, review, had quietly been replaced with a far more dangerous one. Investigation. Oversight committees announced hearings. Inspectors general requested full access to internal systems. Legal teams began preparing for disclosure timelines they never expected to face. What had started as a single press briefing was now pulling entire agencies into the light, and the light was unforgiving. The first whistleblower came forward before noon. Not publicly, at first. Through counsel. Through protected channels. A mid-level data analyst with years inside the system. The message was simple. The public numbers were always a subset. That phrase triggered alarms everywhere. A subset meant selection. Selection meant intention. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered parallel reporting tracks. One designed for internal logistics. Another crafted for public release. The difference wasn't fabricated data. It was omission. Categories quietly excluded. Time frames adjusted. Definitions revised just enough to preserve plausible deniability. No one had to lie. They just had to choose what not to say. More whistleblowers followed. Field supervisors, case managers, IT specialists who maintained tracking databases but were instructed not to expand access. Each account reinforced the same pattern. Efficiency was prioritized over accuracy. Appearance over outcome. The pressure shifted from policy to people. Senior officials who had once spoken confidently now relied on prepared notes. Internal emails grew cautious. Meetings became smaller. Decisions were delayed, then delayed again. The system was protecting itself the only way it knew how. By slowing down. Tom Homan watched it unfold from a distance. He declined formal roles, advisory positions, and political offers. He understood something others didn't yet. Influence in moments like this didn't come from proximity to power. It came from consistency. And consistency, he had. As hearings approached, leaked testimony summaries began circulating. Not accusations, observations, data mismatches, resource warnings that had been acknowledged and shelved. One memo stood out. Written years earlier, it predicted exactly what was now unfolding. The final line read, "If this threshold is crossed, recovery will be structural, not temporary." That threshold had been crossed. Public reaction evolved again. Anger gave way to anxiety. Communities demanded clarity, not rhetoric. Local leaders asked questions federal officials couldn't answer quickly enough. Trust, once broken, refused to be rushed back into place. Then came the personal cost. A senior administrator, unnamed but recognizable within the agency, was placed on administrative leave. Not fired, not charged, just removed. It was a message to everyone else. Cooperation was no longer optional. Phones stopped ringing for some. Started ringing nonstop for others. Behind the scenes, reform proposals resurfaced. Real ones this time. Centralized tracking, mandatory follow-up verification, transparent reporting schedules. Each proposal came with a price tag and a political risk. But now, rejecting them carried greater risk than adopting them. Denial was no longer cheaper than action. Tom Homan was called to testify. Not as an accuser, as a witness. His testimony was calm, methodical, devoid of drama. He didn't speculate. He cited reports, dates, decisions. He explained how systems drift, how small compromises compound, how silence becomes habit. When asked why he spoke out publicly, his answer was brief. Because internally, nothing changed. That line echoed through the hearing room. As testimony continued, something rare happened. Members from opposing sides agreed on one point. The system had failed not because of one decision, but because of many deferred ones. No single villain, just accumulated avoidance. That realization shifted the tone. The goal was no longer to assign blame alone. It was to prevent collapse. By the end of the week, emergency funding was approved. Oversight mechanisms expanded. A timeline for public reporting was announced, with real benchmarks attached. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough yet. But it was movement. Still, one question remained unanswered. Had this all come too late? Because while systems can be repaired, trust takes longer. And trust, once fractured, remembers every crack. The final phase was approaching. Not the political one, the structural one. Reform looks clean on paper. In reality, it collides with people, habits, and systems that were never designed to change quickly. As new directives rolled out, resistance didn't arrive as protest. It arrived as delay. Meetings rescheduled. Software upgrades postponed. Clarifications requested again and again. Nothing openly defiant. Just enough friction to slow momentum. Inside enforcement offices, confusion spread. Some agents were told to implement new tracking immediately. Others were told to wait. Databases that were supposed to sync didn't. Reporting standards differed by region. The very complexity that had once been used as an excuse was now actively working against reform. And then the numbers started moving again. Not upward, sideways. Initial compliance reports showed improvement, but follow-up verification exposed inconsistencies. Some cases were double counted. Others disappeared entirely. The truth became harder to extract the harder people tried to manage perception. This was the moment many feared. When reform threatens exposure, systems often retreat to self-preservation. Internal emails surfaced expressing concern that full transparency would undermine confidence. That phrase appeared again and again. Undermine confidence. As if confidence were something fragile that needed protecting from facts. Tom Homan recognized the pattern instantly. He'd seen it before. Reform stalled not by opposition, but by exhaustion. by making the process so cumbersome that momentum dies on its own. Then came the breaking point. A preliminary oversight report leaked ahead of schedule. It confirmed improvement in intake processing but showed follow-up compliance still far below targets. Worse, it revealed that several regional offices had interpreted the new rules differently, creating data gaps almost as large as before. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. Commentators declared reform a failure. Critics accused officials of cosmetic fixes. Supporters of enforcement felt betrayed. Advocates for humanitarian policy felt misled. Everyone found something to be angry about. Inside leadership circles, panic returned. There were calls to pause the rollout, to regroup, to reframe expectations. One senior advisor suggested delaying public updates until systems stabilized. That suggestion was rejected, not because it wasn't politically tempting, but because everyone understood what delay now meant. Silence would confirm everything. Tom Homan was asked to speak privately with agency leadership. No press, no recording, just a room and a question. How do we make this work? Homan didn't hesitate. You stop managing fear, he said, and start managing facts. He explained that uniform standards mattered more than speed. That incomplete transparency was worse than bad news. That the public could handle reality, but not manipulation. His message was blunt. Pick accuracy or pick optics. You don't get both. That conversation changed the approach. Leadership issued a directive eliminating regional discretion in reporting. One standard, one system, one public dashboard, no adjustments, no narrative framing, just numbers. The backlash was immediate. Unions objected. Administrators warned of exposure. Legal teams raised risk concerns. But the directive stood. For the first time, the system stopped trying to protect itself. And something unexpected happened. Field agents adapted. Freed from conflicting instructions, they focused on execution. Analysts stopped filtering and started measuring. Errors were flagged openly. Corrections published publicly. The data wasn't flattering, but it was real. Public trust didn't surge, but it stopped falling. As weeks passed, the numbers stabilized. Follow-up rates improved incrementally. Not dramatically, not magically, but measurably. The kind of progress that can't be faked. Still, the cost was high. Careers ended quietly. Reassignments multiplied. Political capital evaporated. The system survived, but not without scars. And through it all, Tom Homan stayed where he had always been. Outside the machine. Because the final question wasn't whether reform could work. It was whether honesty could last once the crisis faded. That answer would come next. And it would decide everything. The crisis didn't end with a headline. It ended quietly, the way real systemic change always does, not with applause, but with routine. Weeks turned into months. The cameras moved on. Breaking news found newer emergencies. But inside the system, something fundamental had shifted, and this time, it didn't slide back. The public dashboard stayed live. Every update brought scrutiny. Every error brought correction. There was no hiding behind complexity anymore because complexity was now visible. The numbers told their story plainly, without commentary, without spin. Some days they improved. Some days they didn't. And for the first time in years, that honesty mattered more than the direction of the trend. Communities adjusted. Local governments received clearer forecasts. Schools planned enrollment with real data. Hospitals allocated resources with fewer surprises. The strain didn't vanish, but it stopped arriving unannounced. Predictability replaced chaos, and that alone reduced harm. Inside agencies, a cultural line had been crossed. New analysts were trained differently. Not to protect narratives, but to protect integrity. Reports were written for accuracy first, presentation second. Meetings changed tone. When someone asked how a figure would look publicly, the answer came back faster than expected. It'll look like the truth. That phrase became informal policy. Oversight hearings concluded without spectacle. No mass firings. No sweeping indictments. Just documented failure, recorded correction, and enforceable standards. It wasn't justice in the cinematic sense. It was accountability in the structural one. And that lasts longer. Tom Homan never returned to the spotlight the way many expected. He declined political office. Declined consulting roles. Declined commentary tours. When asked why, he answered simply, "My job was to stop denial. Others can do the rest." History treated him unevenly. Some called him divisive. Others called him necessary. But among those who worked inside the system, his role was understood clearly. He was the interruption. The moment silence stopped working. Years later, when analysts reviewed the data, they marked that press briefing as an inflection point. Not because it introduced new facts, but because it forced old ones into daylight. That mattered more than any policy. Because systems don't fail when they're overwhelmed. They fail when they stop telling the truth about it. The border didn't disappear. The challenges didn't vanish. Migration remained complex, emotional, and deeply human. But the rules of engagement changed. Honesty became the baseline. Transparency became unavoidable. And that made all the difference. Not perfect control, but real control. Not false confidence, but earned trust. In the end, the story wasn't about one man or one moment. It was about what happens when reality is finally allowed to speak without interruption. And once it does, there's no going back.